Too much salad there for me, there's not enough. Good morning, welcome. This morning we're continuing our series on hospitality, and we're looking at Jesus' encounter with Zacchaeus, or I'm not quite sure whether that's a potatoes and a patatas sort of name. I'll interchange probably. I'll be calling him Zacchaeus one minute and Zacchaeus the next, but I am speaking about the same person. And he was the tax collector, wasn't he? I mentioned last week that, if you remember, that Jesus invited himself to Zacchaeus' house, which probably wasn't such an imposition, because it was the Jewish culture, wasn't it, to have and to welcome strangers into their homes. And this was Jesus. This was Jesus after all, wasn't it? And he would have known, wouldn't he, that Zacchaeus' heart and desire would be there to have Jesus come and stay. The major problem we have today, I suppose, with showing or doing or even experiencing hospitality, is our British culture. We are, as a people group, aren't we, more likely to be reserved, in inviting people around to our homes. And that applies, doesn't it, to people that we know well, let alone strangers. And we're also, aren't we, a little bit more wary, I think, about going around to somebody's house if we're actually invited. Our culture is a little bit like, isn't it? Keep yourself to yourself and don't be too familiar. We often hear in other cultures, don't we, that uninvited guests are treated like long-lost friends. Long-lost friends. Whereas in our thoughts about uninvited guests can be, please get lost. We're a little bit less open and a little bit more reserved. I mean, can you imagine the average British person's attitude if a stranger or a mild acquaintance sort of invited themselves around to dinner, like Jesus did? The world would stop spinning, wouldn't it? It would be incredible. Let me just read to you from the Gospel of Luke. It's chapter 19, and it's the first 9 verses from 1 to 9, and this is Jesus' encounter with Zacchaeus. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down and at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham." Jesus was passing through Jericho on the way to Jerusalem, which was about 15 miles away. Jesus in Jericho had previously healed a blind beggar, restoring his sight, and this was the next recorded encounter with a rather short man named Zacchaeus. Now, Zacchaeus wanted to see who Jesus was, and he was that keen to do so. He climbed a tree. I mean, I suppose he must have heard, he may have even seen things that Jesus had been doing, in his ministry, the miracles and the teaching. To Zacchaeus, Jesus was somebody worth seeing. So imagine his surprise when Jesus stopped and looked up and called out his name. I think I'd have fallen out of the tree if it had been me. So how on earth did Jesus know who I was? How did he know who Zacchaeus was? Did somebody tell him, or was it a supernatural revelation from God? I mean, I tend to believe the latter, judging from the response that Jesus got. Because, when Jesus invited him to stay at his house, Zacchaeus welcomed him gladly. The world did not stop spinning, did it? And at this point, we then have the crowd beginning to mutter. He, that is Jesus, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. Last week I said that Jesus was accused of being a glutton and a drunkard, which was a fault. It was a false accusation. But being a friend of tax collectors and sinners, well, Jesus guilty as charged. Just as a side point, I think this little thing tells us to be careful when somebody falsely accuses us of something. I mean, it's a tactic, isn't it, that the great deceiver, that Satan will use himself. He will falsely accuse us of things. And he likes to do that, doesn't he? You see, Satan and other people, they do, and they like to, throw in just a little bit of an element of truth in what they say. And that's just to try and trick you, to get you to believe it all, the lies included. So it's important to weigh everything up. Zacchaeus, he was not only a tax collector, he was a chief tax collector. This was a big deal for the people, because tax collectors worked for the Romans, the Romans being the occupying force in Israel at the time. And tax collectors, they in this particular area, they weren't paid a wage as such, but they were allowed to take extra money from the people. And as you can imagine, this sort of system was open to exploitation. Tax collectors had a reputation of being dishonest, and which is rather ironic, isn't it? Because anything to do with tax today, dishonesty is more from the people they're collecting it from than the tax collectors. But anyway. So in Jesus' time, the tax collectors often became rich at the expense of those they collected from. Now, Zacchaeus would have been especially unpopular because he was a chief tax collector and he was very wealthy. He got that wealth from the people. And he would be considered, because he worked for the Romans, he'd be considered a traitor, a sinner, a person not to be associated at any cost. But here, Jesus was inviting himself to stay with him. In fact, Jesus had many, didn't he? He had many encounters with people the crowd would not approve of. He talked, didn't he, with a Samaritan woman at a well who had 5 husbands, and the man that she was with now wasn't her husband. He let a sinful woman, and from the passage, if you read the passage, it infers that this sinful woman was most likely meaning that she was a prostitute. And he let this woman anoint his feet with this expensive ointment. In Luke chapter 15, Jesus is again accused of welcoming and eating with sinners. And Jesus, doesn't he eats and drinks with another tax collector, Matthew. And he calls, isn't he? He's called Matthew to be one of his disciples. Jesus invited himself to Zacchaeus' home, not because he wanted a free lunch or to impose himself upon anyone. By inviting himself to his house, Jesus showed his acceptance of someone who was regarded as a sinner and treated as an outcast. Jesus was practicing here a very radical form of hospitality for his time, one which the crowd didn't approve of at all. Jesus' actions would be very, very controversial with the Jewish community, but maybe not so for us today, because for us to eat and drink with sinners and whatever a sinner is and tax collectors, it wouldn't actually seem that bad in this world today, would it? I mean, after all, we're all sinners, aren't we? And we're living in a fallen world. I mean, today, doesn't it, just about anything goes. So the world wouldn't be really bothered who you sort of socialised with, or would it? If you practiced radical hospitality like Jesus did in his time, what would that look like for us today? Would the crowd be concerned if you practiced hospitality with a known thief or a drug addict that, maybe still one or has gone through rehabilitation? No, probably not. I don't think the world would bat an eye of that. What about if you practiced this hospitality with a convicted murderer? Again, I don't think people would necessarily think that was a real bad thing. What about a known paedophile? What if you had a chance to dine with Putin? What would the crowd think of you then? A common myth about hospitality is that it should never be extended to known sinners, whatever the sin is, because others will think you approve of their lifestyle. That's a common myth. It's not true. Just like the accusations thrown at Jesus, when he was accused of being a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of sinners and the sin. In fact, there are only two types of people that the Bible warns us about not to extend our hospitality to. In the book of 2 John, verse 10 to 11, we read, "If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not take them into your house or welcome them. Anyone who welcomes them shares in their wicked work." This verse is referring to false teachers who would falsify the Christian gospel message of salvation. They would claim to be Christian, but hold unbiblical or extra-biblical understanding of human origin, which would distort such things as who Jesus is, the cross, grace, the very nature of God, going against all recognised biblical authority. Now, I'm not talking about people who may have a slightly different opinion about biblical doctrine, but people who have completely distorted the Christian faith but still claim to be Christian. The second type of person we are warned about can be found in the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 5, verses 11 to 13. But now I am writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or slanderer, a drunkard or a swindler. Do not even eat with such people. What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked person from among you. Here, the Apostle Paul is speaking about a person who was professed of faith in Jesus and who is part of the church, part of the fellowship, but continues to live openly in continued unconfessed sin. They have an attitude of it's just business as usual, thinking their sinful actions don't matter and they don't warrant any consequence whatsoever. This person who is under the discipline of the church, they should be receiving, I'm not saying you're not going to do anything with them, but they should be receiving counsel, instruction and care from the leadership. The command to withhold hospitality refers only to those inside the church, to those who are misusing the church, its teachings and its people. There are no biblical commands against extending hospitality to unbelievers, and that also includes people of completely different faiths as well. Jesus' radical hospitality, it had a purpose. Now, it wasn't a grand strategy for reaching tax collectors. And it wasn't because he was some sort of easygoing, live and let live kind of Messiah. And it certainly wasn't because drunks and prostitutes were more fun to be around. It was, as Jesus puts it himself, to seek and save the lost. To seek and save the lost. Zacchaeus responded to Jesus by giving half of his ill-gotten wealth to the poor. And he kept the other half so that he could pay back fourfold anyone that he had cheated. And Jesus replied by saying, "Today salvation has come to this house." It wasn't because Zacchaeus had given up his wealth. It was because his heart had been changed, and Jesus knew it. Probably, again, from some supernatural revelation that God has given him. Zacchaeus showed he had changed. It showed he's changed in his heart by his actions. Even though Jesus had come to seek the lost, and he did that an awful lot of the time by eating and drinking with them, it was also the case that the lost were drawn to Jesus. It was Zacchaeus who wanted to see who Jesus was. And people reaching out. And Jesus would gladly spend time with anyone who was open to his teachings. Jesus was a friend of sinners, not because he winked at sin or that he ignored it, or he enjoyed some sort of light-hearted revelry with those who engaged in immorality. Jesus embraced and forgave anyone, like Zacchaeus, who believed in him. He was pleased to welcome and to be with anyone who were open to the gospel message. When we practice radical hospitality like Jesus did, I'm not suggesting that it's for the sole purpose of giving them the plan of salvation on day one. As I said last week, hospitality is about opening our arms and our doors wide with a transparent love. It's about being and showing Jesus to people. And that might or might not involve words. Radical hospitality goes against our cultural norms because the world doesn't understand that you would do something without expecting anything in return. Some people might even refuse your hospitality because they can't believe it themselves, that they don't have to give anything back. Radical hospitality is not about charity, and it really isn't about kindness. However, kindness is something that we should be showing. It's about shaking the very gates of heaven for the souls of the lost. It's about engaging in spiritual warfare. Some people were open to Jesus and some were not. And we'll find that to be exactly the same for us. We must remember that what we do for the lost, what we do for the stranger, we also do for Jesus. Matthew chapter 25, Jesus tells us, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." I don't think our British culture will stretch to us inviting ourselves to other people's houses, like Jesus did. But it may stretch for us to invite those to our homes that don't yet know Jesus. I entitled this preach, "Eating and Drinking with the Lost." And it was for us to just think about the radical hospitality that Jesus showed to a people that needed to hear the gospel message, a people that needed to be saved. Remember last week I said the Greek word for hospitality was philoxenia, which simply means loving strangers. Now, the strangers we invite may not be so strange. In fact, we might actually know the people. But it's about the act of showing Jesus' love to people in a practical way that don't know Jesus. It's not about showing them the error of their ways and preaching to them, but it's about letting God direct the conversation wherever that might take it, and praying for, as Jesus had, maybe some supernatural revelation into the situation. And it may not even be about inviting people around to our homes, but inviting them out maybe for coffee and cake. This radical hospitality will probably look different for each one of us. And because of that, we must be careful not to assume that what God is asking us to do will be the same for other people as well. So whatever form our hospitality takes in this area, one thing we know for sure, Jesus wants us to engage with people and, as always, follow his example. And this may take us out of our comfort zones. And we may not yet be ready for it, or we may not know quite where to begin. And that's fine. But hopefully, over the next few weeks, some of those uncertain gaps may be filled in. As we all seek a greater love for the stranger, we all seek a greater love for the lost in our lives. And hopefully, as always, be guided, be changed and challenged by the Holy Spirit. Let's pray.